Tonight, part 2 of our 360 investigation, the Sissy Boy experiment uncovering the truth. I want to show you a picture of a young man, Kirk Andrew Murphy, that was taken in the early 1970s when he was about 4 years old. A year before, he got enrolled in a government-funded study aimed at making effeminate boys more masculine. His brother says this photo is the last time he remembers his brother Kirk happy. Kirk was just 5 years old when he was treated at UCLA's Gender Identity Clinic under a pseudonym to conceal his real name. The man who ran that study was George Rekers, a graduate student at the time. Rekers called Kirk's treatment, which his family says involved beatings at home, a success. Decades later, the research that was done on Kirk is still being cited by those who think kids can be prevented from becoming gay. And that's what infuriates Kirk's family. They say the treatment that Rekers calls a success literally destroyed Kirk. They want you to know what he went through and the impact it had, they say, on the rest of his life. In tonight's report, we confront Rekers with their allegations.
Kirk, what do you think of your nephew?
He's good. I'll run a camera.
Yeah.
I'm just taking pictures.
Kirk Murphy killed himself nearly 6 months after this video was taken in 2003. He was 38 years old and had struggled with being gay for most of his life. A struggle his family blames on experimental therapy that Kirk was subjected to as a 5-year-old child. Experimental therapy that identified him as effeminate, a so-called sissy boy, and tried to fundamentally change his behavior. Kirk's mother enrolled him in the experimental therapy at UCLA in 1970 because of concerns he was playing with girls' toys.
They were the experts, so I thought they would know what they were doing.
What they really told him was that the very core of who he was broken.
Kirk's family had no idea George Rekers has, for the last 3 decades, used Kirk as an example of a child whose effeminate behavior was successfully altered. In numerous publications, Rekers has written about Kirk, calling him Craig to hide his identity.
I blame them for the way his life turned out. If one person causes another person's death, I don't care if it's 20 or 50 years, it's the same as murder in my eyes.
Of course, the actual reason someone commits suicide is difficult, if not impossible, to know. Kirk's family's allegations that George Rekers' therapy caused Kirk to take his own life are just that, allegations.
I'm Richard with CNN. I'd like to talk to you about your therapy that you did with Craig.
George Rekers didn't respond to CNN's repeated request for an interview, so our producers tracked him down in Florida to ask him about the Murphy family's allegations.
Would you just talk to us for a second about your therapy with the patient named Craig?
It's published.
We've interviewed Craig's family recently. They say that the therapy you did with him as a child led directly to his suicide as an adult. What do you say about that?
I didn't know that. That's too bad.
You're not aware of his suicide?
No.
What do you say to the family if they say that the therapy that you did with him as a child led to his suicide as an adult?
Oh. Well, I think scientifically that would be inaccurate to assume that it was the therapy. But I do grieve for the parents now that you've told me that news. I think that's very sad.
Rekers pointed out that his work with Kirk took place decades before his suicide.
That's a long time ago. You have a hypothesis that a positive treatment back in the 1970s had something to do with something happening decades later. That hypothesis would need a lot of scientific investigation to see if it's valid. 2 independent psychologists of me had evaluated him and said he was better adjusted after treatment, so it wasn't my opinion.
One of those psychologists has since died. The other, Larry Ferguson, told us he did evaluate Kirk Murphy as a teenager. He told us the family was well adjusted and he didn't see any red flags when evaluating Kirk. But Kirk's family says he lied to those examining him, something he learned to do, they say, to avoid punishments, which were part of the experimental therapy Rekers conducted.
He was conditioned to say what he thought they wanted to hear.
Rekers insists the therapy was intended to help Kirk and his parents.
I only meant to help. And the rationale was positive, to help children, help the parents who come to us in their distress, asking questions, what can we do to help our child be better adjusted?
George Rekers has had a nearly three-decade career as a champion of the anti-gay movement. In addition to being a founding member of the Family Research Council, he was also a board member of the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, or NARTH, an organization whose members attempt to treat those who struggle with what they call unwanted homosexuality. Just last year, however, in a surprising twist, George Rekers' days as a prominent anti-gay activist abruptly ended. Rekers was caught with a young male escort he'd hired to accompany him on a trip to Europe. This photograph was taken of them in the airport in Miami. Rekers says he's not gay and denies any sexual contact with the escort. He says he hired him to help him carry his luggage. The escort says he gave Rekers sexual massages while in Europe. Rekers resigned from NARTH after the scandal, and the Family Research Council said in a statement they haven't had contact with him in over a decade. Rekers' reputation among those who oppose homosexuality may be tarnished, but his research is still being cited. In this book, he co-authored Handbook of Therapy for Unwanted Homosexual Attractions. He continues to cite his work with Kirk, whom he calls Craig, as a success. He writes that the case was, quote, the first experimentally demonstrated reversal of a cross-gender identity with psychological treatment. The book was published in 2009, 6 years after Kirk Murphy took his own life.
The research has a postscript to it that needs to be added. And that is to acknowledge that Kirk Andrew Murphy was Craig, and he was gay, and he committed suicide.
What do you want people to remember about Kirk, to know about Kirk?
That this was a little boy who deserved protection, respect, and unconditional love. And I don't want him to be remembered as a science experiment. He was a person.
What happened to Kirk Andrew Murphy isn't just a piece of history. Today, all around the country, children whose families are concerned they may be gay are being sent to therapy based in part on George Rekers' research. It happened to a young man named Ryan Kendall when he was just 14.
I thought there was some legitimacy to this idea that I was an evil sinner who was going to burn in hell. And for years, I thought that God hated me because I was gay.
Orion says the therapy he was forced to get drove him to drugs and into a deep depression. Tomorrow in part 3 of our investigation, you'll hear more from Ryan and from the psychologist who treated him, who says he's kept hundreds of children from growing up to be gay.